still in graduate school now. I thought, well, who else might be able to teach me something about the psychology of the sort of person who would have killed my coworkers? I thought, well, there's John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had been convicted only about 5 years before of 33 sexually sadistic torture murders of boys and young men, 26 of whom were found buried in the crawl space under his house in suburban Chicago. And I knew Gacy was on death row in Illinois, so I wrote to him. Again, I attempted to make my letter, it was detailed enough that he would have known I had read a lot about his case. And like Bundy, or like Manson, I should say, his initial response was very prickly. Like, if you think you know one thing about me from reading his books, you're wrong. It's all theory and myth, and it's the prosecution's hypotheses and speculation. You know nothing about me. But he invited me to write him back. So I did. And that began a correspondence that lasted 3 calendar years. We would exchange letters on average every 2 weeks. So a lot of letters over a 3-year period. And he started calling me on the telephone occasionally. I remember one Saturday morning, I was with my wife and kids getting ready to go to the zoo, and I got a call from John Gacy, and I was signaling my wife, I think I need to take this one. But he would call me, sometimes at unannounced times, and at one point he said, why don't you come out here? Why don't you come out and visit me? And I thought, well, this is important to keep in mind. I had never before been in the room with anyone known to have committed murder. I was my second year of graduate studies at this point, and I thought, well, this is an opportunity I probably shouldn't forego. So I made the 450-mile drive out to death row in southwestern Illinois and met Gacy for the first time, and that was a very memorable occurrence for me. I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I had talked with Gacy on the phone, written lots of letters back and forth, but I didn't know what to expect in person. And the guard who escorted me to the building that housed what the guard called the condemned unit, it was death row, led me into that building, took me up a flight of stairs, and we got to a huge steel gate. And he said, on the other side of this gate is the death row visiting area. That's where you'll be meeting with Mr. Gacy. No other visits are scheduled today, so it will only be you and Mr. Gacy on the other side of this gate. And he said, you'll be meeting in the first room to the right. So he opens the gate, and just as I'm about to walk through the gate, he says, can I just say one thing? I said, yeah. And he said, I know you've traveled a long way to get here from Columbus, Ohio, and I'm sure you know why Mr. Gacy is on our condemned unit. But I just want to remind you that should anything go awry while you're with Mr. Gacy, or God forbid, should a hostage situation develop, you'll be on your own. There'll be no prison officials on your side of this gate, and it's against prison policy to negotiate with inmates. Do you understand what I'm saying? And I gulped and I said, yeah, I do. I wasn't going to turn around and drive back to Columbus. So that sort of shook me when I learned that I had imagined that they might even insist on having a guard in the room with us. I didn't know at the time. And I tell an anecdote in my book. About 3 hours into that first day of meeting with Gacy, I desperately had to pee. And I had meant to ask the guard when he let me into that area, is there a restroom back here? And when he told me this stuff about no one will be there to negotiate or help you should anything go awry, it threw me and I forgot to ask him. So I put it off as long as I could, because who really wants to ask a sadistic sex killer for help finding the restroom? But I finally got to that point, And I said, John, is there a restroom back here? And he said, hell no. Like he was talking to a 3-year-old. And he said, you're going to have to go out there and shout for those guards, and maybe they'll pay attention and maybe they won't. They spend their days playing poker. And he said, you're going to have to really yell if you hope to get their attention. So I went out in the hallway and yelled once, twice, 3 times, a little louder each time. Guard! No response. So I sheepishly limped back into the room where Gacy is waiting for me with a bemused smile. And I'm thinking, this is an absurd situation. I'm thinking, here I am with the one of the world's worst serial killers, and I can't, even by screaming, get the guards' attention to let me out to use the restroom. And Gacy was loving it, my helplessness and his control. And he said, no, you're going to really need to yell if you want to get their attention. So I went out and yelled as loud as I could. And finally a guard came sauntering from around the wall, and he said, can I help you? I said, yeah, you really can. I'm desperate. I need to use the restroom. So he let me out to use the restroom, and Gacy was very bemused by this. But that's an anecdote I always tell to communicate how vulnerable I was. And I was very naive. Gacy greeted me that first day by saying, we shook hands and introduced ourselves to one another. And he said, I know. You're here looking for the monster. But today you're going to meet the man. That's how he talked about himself. Today you're going to meet the man. I said, okay. And so we met for about 6 hours that day, about 6 hours the day after that. And then I made a second trip from Columbus to death row and spent 2 more days with him. So about 20 hours, face-to-face hours altogether with Gacy. No, he was not in a cell at all. It was an open visiting room. There was a table and a chair on either side of it. Gacy arrived with leg manacles and handcuffs on. What sort of freaked me out, it should have freaked me out more than it did in retrospect, but Gacy invited me over to his side of the table at one point. He had these like photo albums, and he had a log book that he wanted to show me. And I remember thinking, I don't want to go over to that side of the table. But I didn't want to communicate fear either. So I did it and sat side by side with him. And I positioned my legs so that I could move quickly away from him if I felt I needed to. And he didn't do anything that caused me to be fearful. But the thought crossed my mind of how easy it would be for him to take his handcuffed hands, put them over my neck, and squeeze. And it would have been very easy. Looking back, I realized that he still had hopes at that point of maybe having his death sentence overturned in the appellate courts. So I think he was on his best behavior with me. He didn't want to do anything that might damage his chances to get some relief in the appellate courts. But what really freaked me out was Gacy was executed in 1994. My visits to him were in 1986 and 87. A young man wrote a book called The Last Victim. His name was Jason Moss. And Jason Moss was a young kid. I think he did this for a course during his freshman year in college. He had a psychology professor who was a well-known researcher in psychology. And with his professor's encouragement, he decided to posture as the ideal victim for a number of serial killers as a way to try to engage their attention. And most of his book concerns his involvement with Gacy. And knowing Gacy's background and the crimes he was convicted of, he presented himself to Gacy as a sexually confused product of a very dysfunctional family. And Gacy bought it hook, line, and sinker. And before long, they were exchanging pornographic fantasies through their letters. And Gacy invited Jason Moss to come visit him too. And when I read Moss's book, it was obvious that he met with Gacy in the same room that I did. The difference is that Gacy at that point was only about 6 months away from being executed. So he understood at that point that his legal options were probably gone. And he was very threatening to Jason Moss. Emotionally abusive, verbally abusive, threatened to rape him, said, you know, this obviously got my attention because of what my experience had been. He said, you know, I'm going to rape you. You will be lying on the floor in blood, and there'll be no one to help you. You could yell, and nobody will come to help you. And I thought, that was my experience, that it was very hard to get anyone to come help. But he threatened Moss explicitly. And it made me look back on my time with Gacy and think, I was pretty naive in a lot of ways. He could have attacked me. He wasn't ever explicitly menacing toward me. I remember after my first day with him, I went back to the Fleabag Hotel that Gacy had recommended for me and called my wife, and she said, well, what were your impressions of Gacy? And I said, well, he was the kind of guy that if I had walked into a bar and sat down at the bar for a beer and he was sitting next to me, we would have talked very easily about sports, politics, and he would have been very unthreatening, which is part of the point, of course. That's how, you know, people like him are able to disarm their victims, and Gacy was very practiced at that. And I told my wife, you know, he would have been very easy to talk with, totally unthreatening, but it wouldn't have taken me long to realize that he was totally uninterested in my point of view about anything. It would all be about him. And that degree of self-absorption and narcissism would have made him stand out after a while. But he was very non-menacing during the time I spent with him. He never threatened me at all. I remember when I first met him and shook hands with him, my conscious thought at that time was what that hand had been involved in. And it was a sobering thought. But he never threatened me, no. He was a physically, I have a picture of him and me together on that first visit. At the time, he was pretty overweight. I remember he had small hands. I was surprised, you know, they weren't like big muscular hands. They were relatively petite, particularly since he had a big bulging gut and, you know, big forearms, but relatively small hands. So, but he wasn't tall. He was relatively, might have been 5'10", 5'9". He wasn't a tall man. So I didn't see him as particularly physically imposing. And, you know, if you know his criminal history, he killed most of his victims by tricking them, like into putting handcuffs on themselves, and then telling them the trick is you need the key and you don't have it, I do. And so he created vulnerability on the part of his victims once he was able to convince them that he wasn't in any way threatening. So I would say physically there was nothing menacing about him. And clearly all of his victims were boys and young men. And his victim category was basically like 16 to 26 or something like that. Which just brings to mind, after my first visit with him, the first letter he wrote me after I was back in Columbus, he said, you know, you looked a lot younger than I expected you to look. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I thought, so he's sort of dragging me down into his victim group. And I also knew, and this was just a weird aspect of my interaction with him, we had the guard take pictures of us. There were two of them, and I gave one to Gacy, and I kept one. And from that point on, I mean, I knew that Gacy was taking that picture of me back to his cell and masturbating, using it as an erotic stimulus. And that's just a weird feeling, to know that you're being used that way by someone who's a sexual torturer. But I would say he was good at coming across as not threatening. But one day we were talking, and he was going on and on and on. I thought I might never get him to stop talking about these two young men who had worked for him, Michael Rossi and David Cram, and trying to make the case that they committed these murders, at least most of them. They had keys to the house, and why didn't the police investigate Cram and Rossi? They were both punks and blah, blah, blah. And I got so tired of listening to him, I said, John, stop. And I think he was surprised that I said that, but I couldn't take it anymore. I said, stop. And he said, okay. And I said, can we talk about something different? And he said, yeah, if you want to. And I said, I'd like to talk about your sexuality. And he said, go for it. I'm totally open. He said, I'm liberal. I'm sexually liberal. I said, okay, well, all of your victims were males. Why is that? And he said, well, people want to say that I'm homosexual, and nothing could be further from the truth. At one point he said to me, I'm asexual. And I said, I don't even know what that means. Like if I see the prefix a before a word, it usually means not anything. Like, I can't remember. I came up with an example, but I would imagine that asexual meant you're not interested in sex with either men or women. But clearly what he meant by it was bisexual. And he said to me, I don't really care. And this is the psychopath and the narcissist coming out. He said, I don't really care who my partner is. It could be a man or a woman. As long as I get off, I don't care. A mouth is a mouth. That's what he said. I remember being a little bit taken aback by that, but he said basically, I don't care. I mean, I don't care who it is as long as I get my needs met. We talked about his sexuality. He was very open to talking about it. When I emphasized the point that all of his victims were male, he said, now there you go with your theories and speculation and fantasy. How do you know I killed those people? I said, well, you got convicted of killing them by a jury of citizens. And he said, no, the prosecution case was totally bullshit. My attorneys forced me to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, which was bullshit. I never wanted to do that. And he said, you're assuming that I killed all those victims. He said, I'll tell you this, I know something about 5 of them. The rest I don't know anything about. I said, okay, well, they were found buried in the crawl space under your house. And he said, well, I can't get into that. My attorneys told me I can't talk about that. So that's how he would shut off conversation about even the 5 who he claimed to know something about. Well, there was only one that he did specifically for me. I bought 3 of his paintings. Well, I bought 2, and he gave me a 3rd one. And there's an interesting story behind the paintings, too. I found it incredible. These incredible things would pour out of Gacy's mouth that I would think, what? My internal dialogue was always something along the lines of, what? When he was talking, he said, I'm not really an artist. But then in the next sentence, he would compare himself to Da Vinci and Michelangelo. I remember thinking, what are you talking about? So he was very proud of the painting he did, but I kept trying to get him to paint what was in his mind. And he wasn't interested in doing that for obvious reasons. But he was a good copier. He would copy other paintings. And the one that he did specifically for me was a knockoff of Picasso's famous drawing of Don Quixote on his steed. And Gacy personalized it. He called his painting The Quest, and he wrote my initials on the shield, on Don Quixote's shield, because he said he saw me as a quester after the truth. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure what to make of that, coming from one of the 20th century's most prolific liars, but that's what he said. There's an interesting story. The third painting is kind of nondescript. It's of a sailor sitting on a dock looking out at the sea. But there's an interesting story behind the second one. Gacy would bring a few paintings out to our meetings, and he would put them on the table leaning against the wall so that they were there while we talked. And he would say, I'm not trying to convince you to buy my paintings, but I do want you to keep in mind that it's by selling these paintings that I get money for postage and able to keep up my correspondence and so on. And he said, you'll be really sorry if you don't buy a couple of these paintings at the cheap prices I'm offering them for, because they're really going to appreciate in value. The two that I bought, I paid $30 each for. And not long ago, I joined a couple of murderabilia groups on Facebook, not because I really wanted to be part of them, but I was interested in the culture. Like, who are these people? How do they relate to one another? What seems to be the basis for their interest in collecting serial killer artifacts? And I decided to test the market. So I put pictures of my three paintings, three of them that I paid a total of $60 for. And that day I could have gotten $8,000. One guy immediately said, I'll buy them right now from you. And I didn't. I wasn't wanting to sell them. I was interested in how much people would pay for them. So Gacy wasn't that off the mark when he said, these are really going to appreciate over time. You should buy them at $30 because they'll be worth a lot more than that down the road. He would bring paintings out to our meetings and prop them up against the wall. And one day I was attempting to draw him out on these 5 murders that he said he knew something about. And he kept putting me off by saying, my attorneys told me I can't talk about that. That's how he would shut down those discussions. And he said, you know what, Jeff? I got pictures of every one of those kids who they say I killed back in my cell. And he positioned his hands like he was going to fan out a deck of cards. And he said, you know what? I look at those kids and they are no more real to me than, and he stopped like he wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. And then he looked at this painting he had done of the 7 dwarfs. And it's the painting depicts the 7 dwarfs at the mine, and there's a shovel in the lower left-hand corner of the painting, which is of interest in the case of someone who had 26 bodies buried under his house. But he said, those kids are no more real to me than those cartoon characters. And I remember thinking, that might be the first completely true thing this man has said all day. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. These repeat killers, serial killers, are very ambitious. And it's a weird word to use for killers. But at some point in their life, they elect this career of killing that becomes the center of their life. It's exciting to them, it's stimulating. They love playing the cat and mouse games with the authorities. And they're not the kind of people who would be content to live the life of a low-rent criminal committing petty criminal acts on the margins of society. They want something much bigger than that, and they perceive themselves in very grandiose terms. Gacy's an interesting example. He never stopped grinding. I mean, even when he was in prison, corresponding, painting. By the end of his life, somehow, I don't know how he convinced the prison authorities to let him get away with this, but he had a call-in line where people could call in and pay a certain amount of money and hear Gacy's voice. So he was just always working it, trying to make money, and he was a huckster and a very hard worker, which he was always quick to emphasize. I had this business and I worked so hard all the time. When would I have had time to kill these people? That's one of his often repeated lines. But for Gacy, producing these paintings was one of his side gigs, and he worked very hard at it. Manson, had his own kind of celebrity, and he died in 2017. But when I tell people my Manson stories, I was reminded these occurred in the mid-70s, 50 years ago. The murders that occurred only 5 years before. And over the many years that have elapsed since then, Manson has been kind of a cultural anti-hero, along with everything else he was, a violent psychopath. He was a performance artist. If you watch his interviews with Geraldo Rivera, Charlie Rose, Diane Sawyer, they're fascinating to watch. You can't take your eyes off him. He's very charismatic in his way, and he knows it. He developed those skills in prison, and then when he got out of prison with the people who congregated around him before the murders. And so he's fascinating to watch. Bundy was always a mystery to people. He was this kind of phantom, this cipher, who would kill all these women and disappear into thin air. And people were fascinated by how he could get away with it. A term that I often use when I talk about these repeat killers is performative inscrutability. Like being a puzzle is part of it for them. They love that. As long as they remain a puzzle, they are a source of curiosity among people like me and other people in the culture. And one of the most notorious Ohio cases that I worked on in my career was a serial murder case that took place in the late 80s, early 90s. And this killer who would kill strangers with a high-powered rifle, people who had no interaction with, no prior history with, he didn't touch them, there was no known sexual component. He would just shoot strangers out on remote county roads in 5 different counties in eastern Ohio. His name was Thomas Lee Dillon. And in my interviews with Dillon, the thing he said most frequently is, have you ever heard of a case like this? Like, isn't this a unique case? Has there ever been a case in Ohio like this? Guy goes out, kills people he's never seen, no sexual component. Then the guy goes home to his wife and 10-year-old kid. Has there ever been a case like this? So he was very much of the mind of what aspects of his case distinguished him and made him different. And he would say, why did I do it? I don't know. I don't know why I did it. That's for you to figure out. So he loved being a puzzle. And he would make it sound in talking to me like he would commit these murders and drive home and life would just go on as though it was a little blip, just something that happened. I knew that wasn't true. I knew that these killings were immensely exciting to him and that he spent most of his time fantasizing about killing. And I know for sure that the 3-year, 4-year period when these murders took place were the most stimulating, most exciting part of Dillon's life. He was a very bright guy, graduate of Ohio State's journalism school, worked for the Canton Water Department for 20 years, had a wife who was a LPN at the local hospital, sang in the church choir. They had a 10-year-old son. But all of that bored him. And he would never have admitted it, but these years of killing were the most exciting chapter of his life.